everybody. We're going to start, and well, day 3. Let's try to keep tonight short, to the point, with enough time for making our plans for tomorrow, and we'll have a short modified discussion of sound, and then we'll break into teams and do all our planning, and then we're going to do some projection mapping for those who are interested. But we're going to begin with Greg. He's got a PowerPoint and he wants to just put us back on track on the whole harm reduction theme.
Yeah, so as we're shaping our concepts and figuring out the content for our projects here, I think it's probably a good idea to revisit some of the core principles of harm reduction, since ostensibly that's kind of what these projects are at least connecting up with in some kind of way. Just so that we're all on the same page, I thought I would share a quick primer. I think this will be like 15 minutes. And if it's, too rudimentary for you, I apologize. But we'll just kind of run through some of the basic principles of the harm reduction paradigm, which is really a philosophy and set of practices for working with people who use drugs. And there are some key points that I want to make, and I'll try to underscore them as we go through. The power of any positive change. Any positive change is a phrase that's gotten a lot of traction since the 1980s in the harm reduction field among people who work with people who use drugs actively. And the paradigm itself falls at the other end of the spectrum from prohibition. So there's the prohibition, abstinence only way of thinking. This is a very different, in many ways, opposite way of looking at understanding substance use, substance consumption, even intoxication itself. And so we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. So the basic premise here is that every single one of us as a human being knowingly subverts, screws up, undermines, and otherwise sabotages our own well-being. Like we have talked, I think we said something about this last night. Every single day we do something that we know probably isn't the best thing, or maybe it was 2 nights ago, the best thing for us to do for ourselves emotionally, physically, financially. The example that I had the other night was that I ate a Persian, knowing that I probably shouldn't eat a Persian. And then I had some bourbon later on in the night, and then I went on Amazon.com and shopped. And that's a really bad combination of things. I know it's bad for my pocketbook. It's bad for my physical health. But we eat the wrong things. We drive somewhat recklessly or inattentively sometimes. We have sex, which is inherently risky. We play sports, we shop, we buy stuff that we can't afford. We walk, which is also dangerous. Basically anything after waking up is a risk. And then, just like not doing anything at all is also risky. Indolence, just like sitting and being a couch potato forever, years on end, is also not particularly healthy. Why do we do these things knowing that they're not good for us? Well, we do them because we're human, and that's what humans do. And included in this list, of course, is consuming psychoactive substances, particularly the lethal ones like alcohol and nicotine, both of which I consume almost daily. But given that humans knowingly subvert their own well-being, we've developed a whole set of mechanisms and systems and procedures and buffers, a whole infrastructure for helping us to not do as much damage to ourselves as we otherwise would do. In wrestling, what are some of the things that people do to minimize damage?
Knee pads, taping fingers, headgear, making sure you're resting on mats, warming up.
Very good. That's a really great list. Exhaustive, it seems to me. What about driving? What are some of our harm reduction measures in driving? Because we're all pretty bad drivers, whether you think you're good or not. What's that?
Road signs.
Road signs?
Rules of the road, laws.
Seat belts, rules of the roads.
Safeties on vehicles. Slow down.
Safeties on vehicles.
No texting.
No texting. Sidewalks, right? Separating pedestrians from motor traffic, right? Is a fundamental act of harm reduction. They're built into our everyday life. When you look around the room, you'll see electrical outlets. They have plates on them so the wires are not exposed. That is a harm reduction measure. Many elements of this room are designed for harm reduction, for reducing harm. So they're all around us all the time, and we generally just take them for granted, and we oftentimes, people will get freaked out when we start talking about drug-related harm reduction. Mainly those people just don't like people who use drugs, and they just don't think that they deserve any kind of harm reduction attention. So stigma plays a big role in how we think about translating basic core ideas of protecting ourselves and protecting each other in community, translating those same ideas into the world of people who use drugs is a political act. It's a very politicized move, and that's generally when people resist it or oppose it, that's why. Because they carry a huge stigma toward people who use drugs, and they don't want to see them benefit from investments in the kind of care that we provide to each other, even though we're all in some way a psychoactive substance user, even if it's just caffeine. So this is an example of a harm reduction measure behind a hotel in Liverpool, and they're just trying to further barricade and prevent people who gather in this little corner to smoke cigarettes from getting hit by cars that come around that corner.
Didn't work all that well.
No, they keep the barricades down on purpose because
okay.
when so it's just like, it adds further, like, I don't know, demarcation. We even reduce harm for people that have too many eyes. For people who have too many eyes, this is the gentle eye remover. I think it's supposed to be eye makeup remover, but it's a misprinted ad. So we're really invested in harm reduction for everyone, even for people who have too many eyes, but not so much for people who use drugs. This is a young man, 21 years old, Mikey, in San Francisco, where there are many prohibitions that require people who are homeless and precariously housed to do their private functions in public. In this case, and that includes defecation, urination, eating, but those very things, when done in public, are criminalized by the city of San Francisco. So essentially, being a person in San Francisco who's unhoused is a criminal act. This is inside of a public toilet, which they call space toilets, and he's preparing an injection of opioid pharmaceuticals that have been reformulated on an extended release basis, which makes them very difficult to inject and means that he does a lot more damage to himself because the pharmaceutical industry has reformulated these pills to make them hard to inject, which means you need a lot more water, a lot more, several more syringes than usual, which is many more punctures, so on and so forth. You get the idea. So, again, we haven't really done a very good job globally in investing in harm reduction measures for people who use drugs. I say this coming from a perspective known as harm reduction, which is also called harm minimization, harm limitation, risk reduction, and so forth. And it's all really about a philosophy which translates into policies and programmatic efforts to decrease the negative effects of drug use and to increase, maximize the positive, beneficial, pleasurable aspects of drug use. So this isn't all about just like we're going to contain disease, we're going to prevent death and morbidity, but we're also going to do what we can to make drug use patterns more capable of producing pleasure and satisfaction in people's lives, in the lives of people who use those drugs. How do we do that with alcohol? We already have safe drug consumption facilities. What are they called? Bars. Right? How does a bar attempt to reduce harm and enhance pleasure of alcohol consumption?
It's controlled. If you have your smart serve, you learn to see the signs of inebriation,
Yep.
and that's when you offer water, you slow down, or you cut them off.
Yes. And how are drinks served at a bar? Do they give you a bottle
One
of
at a time.
whiskey?
That's it. Yeah.
Can you buy a bottle of whiskey at a bar? No, you cannot buy a bottle of whiskey at a bar. I mean, you can, but it's illegal, right? So portion control, assessment, surveillance, monitoring, training protocols in place, right? Designated driver systems. We have a whole bevy of measures to try to both reduce the risk and enhance the pleasure. So again, this is a philosophy and set of policies that is in direct opposition in many ways to abstentionism, or the abstinence-only model. It is definitely rooted in a public health approach. It is evidence-based, but it's also deeply rooted in ideals of humanitarianism. It's very pragmatic in that we're really talking about very specific strategies that we can use and help people to develop as ways to minimize their harm or their risk of harm related to drug use. And it's really about meeting people where they're at. So I've been doing street outreach for 18 years. 4 or 5 years into it, I met a young woman who was 21 at the time. She had started injecting when she was 12 years old, and she was injecting 28 bags of heroin a day when I met her. And she really wanted to do something different. And she would come to the syringe exchange every week, which by the very act of coming to the syringe exchange, we know there's an indication that she cares about her health and her life and her well-being. She didn't want to die. She didn't want to get an infection. So she would come to the syringe exchange program to get sterile syringes and equipment. And I worked with her over a period of about 9 months because, this is what she wanted to do, was reduce her intake. And she wanted to think about different ways to approach heroin injections so that that number would go down somewhat organically. So we began to talk and talked extensively over a 9-month period about times of the day when it made more sense for her to use than not use, times when it made more sense to not use than to use, and then begin to think about how to ritualize that. If you've ever been a smoker or a coffee drinker, you know that the best intake is which one? First one. Right, the first one in the morning, right? The first cigarette, that first cup of coffee, and then together, right? And then after a meal, right? And so these are kind of ritualized. So if you've ever quit doing either of those things, you know that the easiest ones to lop off are the ones that are really non-ritualized, right? That's where you start. You start chipping away at those moments when they're not particularly salient or resonant with you emotionally. And that's what she did. And so she got down to 2 bags in 9 months. So she went from 28 bags a day to 2 bags a day. Then she tried to get into a methadone program in Chicago, and the methadone program denied her because she wasn't using enough heroin. So here are some founding notions that are really important for all of us to understand when it comes to the harm reduction perspective. And these notions freak some people out because we don't know how to talk about drugs, particularly drugs in the context of pleasure maximization. We also don't know how to talk about sex. Has anybody here had your parent teach you how to have sex for pleasure? Nope. That's deeply unfortunate. It is deeply unfortunate because if you're having sex in life, you're having sex for pleasure. You're also maybe sometimes very episodically having it for procreation, but for the most part, you're having sex with someone else or with yourself for pleasure. And we don't know how to talk about that. We don't know how to talk about drug use for pleasure. And so that's a real void in the discourse, and it's deeply unfortunate because these are fairly risky things to be doing. Sex is fairly risky in a lot of ways. Substance consumption can be fairly risky as well. And so just leaving, our younger generations, to their own devices is, I think, a huge disservice. So drug use is normal. It's a legitimate form of pleasure seeking for as long as we have records of human life, written records, or any kind of sort of graphical records. We know that all of those humans were using substances to alter their consciousness. Recovery is something in harm reduction that we realize to be very differential, very complicated, very nonlinear, very discontinuous. The first priority is to decrease negative consequences. The second priority is to help people get to a position where the drug use makes sense for them, where they are feeling good about it. A small change yields enormous benefit. Going from shooting 28 bags a day to shooting 24 bags a day is a massive differential. There's a huge increase in one's well-being when that happens. Positive change is relative and unique to the individual. Everybody has a different path that they're on, and we try to meet them where they're at and to help them along the path that they have set for themselves. All behavior change is very gradual, manifests in fits and starts. We go forward a little bit, we go backwards, sometimes more than we've gone forward. And that's true for all human behavior, not just substances. And, you know, we do all of this work in the context of personal relations. So the filmmaking I do is based in the same set of practical humanitarian principles as the outreach that we do in harm reduction. You build relationships with people, because if people don't trust you, they're not going to entrust their well-being to you, whether that's their, you know, well-being in the context of service provision or filmmaking. And the basic realization is people use drugs because they feel better using those drugs than not using those drugs. We don't believe that cure is a reasonable goal. Abstinence is often a very unreasonable goal. Most programs, particularly in the US, but increasingly in Canada, are abstinence-based and are based on a 12-step model. 12-step is not treatment. It's not even close to being treatment. It is not a bona fide treatment modality. That's just all there is to it. It is a social support group. That's what 12-step is. If you know, I'm sure you're familiar with 12-step, right? There's just nothing about it that's treatment. It works for the people that it works for, and that's really awesome. And as harm reductionists, we advocate for, you know, all available options, from 12-step to methadone maintenance to Suboxone to prescription heroin, which is actually the most effective intervention for people who are using street heroin, is prescription heroin. It is the #1 thing. It works better than all others. So just like eating sugar doesn't cause diabetes, usually, insulin can't cure it. Focusing on reasonable, achievable goals, managing symptoms, minimizing permanent harms, maximizing pleasure, helping people to figure out how to manage and moderate their use, and also to pursue less risky modes of administration. So going from injection to snorting is a huge step in a healthful direction. Going from injection to smoking your drugs is also a really good move for the health. We don't see that there's any moral issue at all with drug use. Drugs are completely benign, and there's no moral quality associated with them whatsoever. Our main kind of focus is helping people stay alive and as healthy as possible for as long as possible, because whatever we want those people to do is pretty much irrelevant, but they're not going to be able to do anything if they're dead. There are many different kinds of harm reduction programs, from syringe exchange to methadone to drop-in centers and other kinds of facilities. We do a lot of different things in the context of doing harm reduction, so helping people to figure out ways of more safely consuming their drugs, more effectively managing their doses, transitioning from one mode of ingestion, like injection, to another, like snorting, providing all the supplies that would be needed for those modes of administration and consumption. Helping people with vaccination for hepatitis A and hepatitis B, which are vaccine preventable, unlike hepatitis C and the other hepatitises, which run up to M or N right now. We just don't often hear about those other ones. Distributing the antidote, naloxone, to opioid overdose, teaching people how to use it, how to recognize ODs, and so on. When my son was 16, he got into spraying graffiti. And so this can cause a problem for a young person who's vandalizing private property. So we ended up getting tarps and affixing those. He would spray paint the tarps in the garage, and then we would affix those tarps to the properties that he wanted to tag. Nice. That's harm reduction. It is person-centered. He was going to commit the crimes no matter what. And so I just helped him to do it in a way that would minimize the negative consequences. Harm reduction demands engagement with the whole person. And this is going to be really important conceptually and in developing the content for your pieces. Language is a system of communication that we have, spoken and written language, right? This is how we try to understand things. Many would argue that we don't even know what the world is without a linguistic system. And therefore, the linguistic system in place is what determines our emotional, cognitive, psychological reactions to what we see happening around us. Without certain constructs like language, we wouldn't know how to feel about anything. So we're going to begin with person-centered language. There's a huge movement worldwide, but particularly in North America, the US, and Canada, to question, problematize, critique, and revamp the way we talk about people who use drugs, the way we refer to people who use drugs and the various issues connected to their lives. And there have been revisions, federally. The communication systems in both Canada and the US have issued guidance to journalists in particular, because they are, I won't say they're the worst offenders, because us in our daily lives, we are the worst offenders, but journalists definitely make the matter worse and increase stigma by the terminology they use. So while neither of these, sort of federal efforts can mandate reporters to change the way they talk and write about people who use drugs, they're definitely trying to make that difference. So instead of saying addict, which we don't say, it's a stigmatizing term, we say person with a substance use disorder, or simply a person who uses drugs, or a person who injects drugs. This is all person-centered, first-person-centered language. So we wouldn't say, oh, wow, if you say, oh, yeah, I was diagnosed with breast cancer, I would say, oh, yeah, you're cancerous. I wouldn't say that. It just doesn't happen. And if you happen to be somebody who has diabetes, it's not how you're known. Oh, did you meet Dale? He's the diabetic. No. We don't do that, right? So addiction is a very particular form of mental illness with very specific diagnostic criteria. The word addict is pejorative and stigmatizing. And so it's not a word that we condone using. So instead of saying an addict or something, oh, she's addicted to heroin, we say, oh, she happens to have a substance use disorder involving heroin or opioids. Addiction, substance use disorder, instead of alcoholic, person with an alcohol use disorder. It changes things. It makes it bulky, inelegant, but the price of elegance and shorthandedness is stigma, and we're not willing to pay that price anymore. So we don't say things like clean and dirty, and talking about drug habits or substance abuse or drug abuse. These are not clinical terms. Drug abuse, substance abuse, they're not clinical terms. They're moral terms that we don't use. And so you sort of get the idea here. But, people who use drugs, that's the general kind of framework for the nomenclature. It is person-centered, even though we don't necessarily have good reason. Humans arguably have no moral value. Earthworms do a lot of good work for the earth. Humans are, by all evidence, destroying the earth. Earthworms and trees have a real moral value. They actually contribute to the sustenance and renewal of the planet. By all objective scientific indication, humans do not, even those of us who recycle. So let's not do any more harm than we're already going to do just by living. A few closing remarks. In harm reduction, we recognize radically the agency of people who use drugs. If you have ever been a drug user or known somebody who uses drugs, see, I just did it, drug user. If you've ever known somebody who uses drugs, or you yourself have used drugs, illicit drugs in particular, you realize that you need to have a great deal of moxie, grit, and resourcefulness in order to make that happen in a system that not only criminalizes you, but also attempts to ostracize and imprison you and degrade and debase and defile your character for the rest of your life. So if you think you've got agency, try hanging out with a person who injects heroin. They've got 10 times what I've got or what you've got. So we see these scenes and we're like, oh, that's really terrible, that's really disgusting. But in harm reduction, we say like that's really resourceful. That takes a lot of perseverance. That takes a lot of stamina and resourcefulness to live in situations that many people will define as bleak and horrifying. We operate on pragmatic personalism, again, in the context of developing personal relationships with people and, helping them come to a point where they see us as a trustworthy source of information and assistance on how to make the positive change that they have defined for themselves, which usually is not abstinence. We try to keep things simple and to the point, offering a buffet of options. And the model is really knowledge plus the means to realize and actualize that knowledge of an improved state of existence is where it's at. And so we try not to deny anybody either the knowledge or the means for actualizing that knowledge for the purpose of creating positive change. And I think that is all I really wanted to say. So that's a really quick overview of some big ideas and big principles in harm reduction. And I thought I would try to get those out there, and maybe they'll help you as you develop the content of your projects. Questions, thoughts, comments?
Well, I really appreciate this talk that you've given, because it gives you, it helps us all be a little more sensitive instead of just insensitive to other people's worlds and look at things in a different way. So I think that is like one of the best things that you can be developing in yourself as a filmmaker, as a creator, as an artist. Because I think artists are the people that see the world in a, like they can just free themselves from, all of the big code that's been ingrained in us, and the, big brother telling us we got to do this, and these are the laws, and this is how we need to treat each other. Mm-hmm. And so when you're trying to tell someone else's story, because I always go back to that, unless you're so narcissistic, you're only making films about your own experience and yourself, which in some cases that's relevant.
Mm-hmm.
Like Frida Kahlo, all she did was she painted herself over and over again, but it was obviously she took it to a much larger space than herself. But most of us who are being creative, we're actually we're trying to find like a bigger truth mm-hmm. that everyone can then relate to, mm-hmm. or in some small way, right? So that somebody from Thunder Bay, can make a piece of work using media that somebody somewhere else in a completely different culture, across the planet, can watch it and just sort of relate to it. Mm-hmm. And say, oh yeah, that's neat. That's a good story. Right. Yeah. So, but it's like it's only our like our fettered view mm-hmm. of things, and that can sometimes keep us from just making that little breakthrough because like the best films, it's like when you look at them, you're like, oh yeah, you see something that you never saw before that was just always there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's important too. I mean, if you're making media, whatever kind of media around, issues concerning to people who use drugs, it's important to realize that, just like any system, right, the drug control system conditions people, whether it's through public health or law enforcement, conditions the outlaws to have a certain script and to talk about their lives and their activities in ways that are socially approved. Like, so if you went out on the street right now and, interviewed somebody who's, who uses drugs, they would probably say, yeah, I really want to get clean. I really want to stop. I really want to, get a job and move into a house. And then those things might be true. They may not be true, but that's what you're going to hear. And that's all you're really going to hear, because that's what they have been rewarded for saying in the treatment program, often many harm reduction programs, certainly in the criminal justice system, and sort of understanding, like even just the basic idea that, people who use drugs use them because they feel better using them than not using them. Like that is just like a fundamental realization, which is very obvious, but like the more you think about it, the less obvious it is, because if that's the basis on which you approach a conversation, all kinds of other things open up. And what, I think also like refraining from, or kind of like keeping a check on our conditioned verbal and nonverbal judgment in those situations is important, right? Because then, you know, the less of that that's there and is perceived by the person that we're working with, then the more honest that conversation is going to be, and the more revealing it will be, and therefore the better the media will be, the film that you're making or whatever you're doing. You know, so it's coming at it from a completely different paradigm. And it's not easy.
I think you really opened my eyes about like the whole pleasure aspect of it. It's one of the things that I never really thought about when you always think about people who do drugs, and you're always thinking that like they want to get clean or get rid of it, you know, but you never really think that like it's just another vice in somebody else's life that like people are just doing for pleasure.
Right.
I just thought that was something I never really thought about until now.
I also really appreciate this line of thinking in a lot of ways, because I heard this quote a while ago. It was actually about use of cuss words, but I think it applies a lot in the same way, where it's like, if you remove the stigma, or if you remove the taboo, it stops being risky behavior, kind of idea, right? And so, and that may sound really oversimplified, but essentially what it refers to is this idea where in a society where these things exist, you can't just divide it into people who know about it and people who don't know about it. So it's like, so I don't use heroin, but I don't know anything about it at all. And so my preparedness for a situation where things are going dire or where someone needs my help, right? I have no frame of reference whatsoever. And that's supposed to somehow make me feel like I'm better than this person because I've never been around it.
Right.
But maybe I'm as ignorant as I think they are, right? Like,
Yeah.
and so it's, I like the search of knowledge and understanding of it all. I think the kind of a question everything mentality, I really like it.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting. I just had a conversation with my dearest friend who's an anti-schooler, so she's not just a homeschooler, but is in the anti-schooling movement. So she's got a 5-year-old daughter's, you know, involved in the anti-schooling way of learning about how to be in the world. And, you know, it's sort of like where that's concerned, it's you know, in public discourse, there's a real problem. Like for me, like one of the fundamental problems of public discourse and civic association is that we assume equal knowledge. And so people will talk to her and be like, yeah, well, why are you, that's the wrong thing to do. That's not cool. Your kid needs to be, and it's like, there, you know, people who do that assume equal knowledge, that like my friend and that person who's arguing with him have equal knowledge of the situation, of my friend's daughter, of the context in which she's operating, of the family in which she's in, and the community that she's a part of. And it's just not true. Yeah. You know, and so like that's a really important thing to do. And I think it's important to check that as a filmmaker, right? And for me, this is harm reduction is, whether I'm making media with or about people who use drugs or doing something completely different, these essentially translate into a set of ethical principles for me in the way that I try to operate. Like the first thing I'm always, you know, attentive to is don't do harm with this piece of work. You know, don't make fun of somebody, don't, you know, and all of that stuff. So yeah, no, I'm totally right there with you. And it's really a struggle. Like I use the term drug user. Right? I'm still caught up in that, and there are times when I get really frustrated. I'm like, damn, I just wish you weren't high right now. Like this is really irritating. You know, and I'm trying, and you know, and it's just like it's so deeply conditioned. It's in all of us. And it's not about pointing fingers. It's just about, okay, there's a different way of looking at this, sort of like a historical human development kind of way.
I really like that it's such a broad matter. Like, there's so many different aspects of your life that you can apply harm reduction to. And a lot of people don't even really consider it. When they hear harm reduction, they automatically assume that it has to be related to like drug use. But like just your opening slides, or like some of the slides, just thinking about all the street signs, everything that we put into place in society to like help people not make mistakes is in some way a form of harm reduction.
Right.
And it, like definitely like your experience with harm reduction, it focuses more on like the street use and maybe reducing the negative side of it. But at least from my personal experience through what I would do with BaySafe is it's mostly working with people who are partying, so mostly people who are pleasure seeking. And like I've definitely seen like some challenges with that myself, because like there's gonna be some people who are going out just to have a fun time, and maybe the substance use kind of comes secondary. Then there's also gonna be people who that is their primary objective, is to get fucked up in some way, and you can't tell somebody, despite seeing whatever condition they're in, that like you need to stop using, you can't use, and it can definitely be very frustrating. So I can definitely understand, like, you know, when you're trying to film somebody and like you're not getting much because they're just really high and they're having a difficult time, maybe like processing or just talking, like it can be very challenging, because like you want to be able to help people, but at the same time you can't force change.
Right.
And like the one motto that we use often, that we've adopted from anchors, and I think they may have used from DanceSafe as well, is like just say no, K-N-O-W, instead of just say no, because it's the process of just teaching people, and that's where really like I think really fits in well with like all the films, no matter what sort of film that people seem to be working on in the room here, it can incorporate like knowledge as a form of harm reduction through a very quick video, maybe just a couple minutes, and like you can convey a lot through that, especially through video.
Right. Right.
Well, I just don't think you can have like a legitimate conversation about anything if the topic at hand is either like, it's like, okay, well, I occasionally use substances, I always use substances, and then your response is like, well, could you not? Or like it's just not, there's nothing constructive there, there's nothing to build on, there's like,
Right.
that's not, I can't imagine just operating like that, so like, I just think it's, yeah, it's really
Right. I mean,
positive movement in terms of those type of discussions, right? Like,
right. Yeah, and I mean, harm reduction is what we do with and for people we love. And we don't do it with people that we don't love, particularly people we don't like, like actively don't like. And that's where the problem is. And it's a shame-based system, right? And the more we can do individually to interrupt that shame, which is the mechanism by which stigma gets delivered, I think the better, really. Because there's nothing worse than having somebody say, I'm ashamed of you. Ah, that hurts.
just hearing it sounded ouchy.
I know, right? Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions, comments to close this out before we move to sound, the sound and the fury?
I just never thought of the, I realized like probably in my own life, like I've probably said addict or something like that to the wrong use, and I actually can recall like having said something like that.
Me too.
And then like I felt like crap immediately, because like they turned and were like, hey, like I kind of struggled with that, and I was like, oh man, like I was just rolling over phrases, and I didn't realize how ingrained a lot of things like that are.
Yeah.
It's like just negative terms for just people in general that like you don't think about, and like I would never say something like racist to
Right.
someone, because like I've become like I've thought of like, you know, watch, you don't say anything like that, like there's words that you don't think of, but at the same time I'll easily like say use the word crackhead or something like that, or
Yeah.
junkie, and just kind of be like, oh, why am I saying that? Like probably shouldn't, right?
Right.
There's not much of a stigma built on it just yet.
Yeah.
Well, because
Yeah.
it seems like the consensus in the media and just around is that like you should shame those people.
Yeah.
When I went to school, it was like,
You don't
no, abstinence, no. And
Right.
like, the more people shout abstinence, the more I was like, hey, there's a bunch of guys going out behind the school. Like, I want to go see what they're up to. I want to go hang out.
Right.
Like, everybody, you know, it just.
you can't do something that makes you want to do it more.
And I think I've been placed in positions that I'm lucky enough I didn't get too like caught up in, that I'm happy I didn't, you know,
Right.
because, you know, I was put in a position like, oh, don't do this, but then you're like, oh, you know,
Yeah.
everybody's curious and everybody's,
Right. Is anybody here a school teacher?
but
Is it the cord or?
I was just say, like, it's so eye-opening. Here's what I recommend to everybody. So
Yeah,
if you
on a
really
big
want to
screen
see
now.
like the interior of hypocrisy, make friends with a school teacher and then go to parties that they go to, and just watch how screwed up people will. Yeah, they'll just get torqued on massive amounts of alcohol and drugs. But no, it's a good, like, it's just a very casual thing. But we don't say, you know, you're a cancer if you have like, you know, if you've been diagnosed with some form of cancer. But yeah, with these terms are just casually circulating, and they're, you know, they're degrading.
So great. This is Nadine.
Oh, hey,
we
Nadine.
haven't met yet in
Hi.
Sioux Lookout.
Sorry,
And
I came a little bit late, and I wanted to ask a question. I think it's a fascinating, everything you're talking about. What do you think, can you speak a little bit about the responsibility of a filmmaker when dealing with someone who is under the influence of drugs, and being able to relay their story, and conscious of the, you know, their privacy, conscious of what they might release in an intoxicated state when they might not say the same things if they were sober? And how do you navigate people's privacy and being careful with their personal stories?
That's a really good question. The first thing I do is try to talk anybody who wants to be in a film project out of being in the film project. So I always say, you know, it's probably not a good idea to do this, because given the way our culture works and the way our society is structured, this will fix you at a particular point in your life, and this may not be the place you want to be. Maybe it is the place you'll want to be 10 years from now, but it's a deeply stigmatized place. We all know that, and it's probably not a good idea to be in this film. So I always say that. And then if the conversation keeps going, and it often does, then I just make sure that I never release anything without everybody who appears in it seeing it first and saying, they may not always like it. As I said on the first night, I don't think you were on the other end for that first night. Generally, the response I get is like, I'm not super crazy about that depiction, but you got it right. And no one's ever said, don't show that. So, I mean, so that's kind of on the front end. I actively try to talk people out of it. It's probably not a good idea to do this, because it's going to be out in the world, and this is how people are going to know you. And maybe you know, none of us wants to be known by only one thing. Like, oh, that's the person with bad breath. Like, that's a terrible thing to be known for if that's the only way that people relate, you know, identify you. And so at the back end, I don't ever release anything publicly without all of the people who are appearing in it seeing it first and actively approving it. In the middle, if someone, you know, because you can't, you know, the situations that I'm in, people wander in, they wander out. There's a lot of like shifting in the social scene. And so I can't always explain it to somebody who like walks into the room and it's the first time I'm meeting them and they see I've got a camera, and then somebody else says, oh, he's just making this video, blah, blah, blah. But I don't really have time to adequately explain it. I always make sure that I do adequately explain it. As soon as there's a break in the action, I sit down with them and explain it, and again, try to talk them out of it, and then make sure if they do want to continue being included in it, they see the final result if they're included in the final result. So that's my answer.
That's great advice. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, I guess it's just about being just as transparent as possible with it, right? It's like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and again, like, this applies to everybody here, and whatever project you're doing for this workshop or whatever other project you do in your life, it's your project, right? Which again sounds kind of crass, like it's your life, but it's my story. I'm telling you whatever story I'm telling, and it's about your life, and it's essentially you're the material for it, which in some ways, like very abstractly and maybe like existentially, makes documentary just inexcusable. I don't know, because there's an inherent sort of exploitation there. But there's probably an inherent exploitation to everything. But I think that also, if you think about that a little bit more, you give it a few more seconds of life, that phrase, you know, it's your life, but it's my movie or my project, it really puts the responsibility, the ethical responsibility back on you as the filmmaker. And it acknowledges that. And it's like, okay, yeah, that's true. This is my story. I am using their life as material to tell a story that I will be applauded for. I will be congratulated for it. It may get into a film festival. It may get me some kind of career advancement or some kind of status increase in my life. That is not going to accrue to the people in your project. Like 9.9 times out of 10, it's just not going to. No one has, in any of the films I've ever made, no one has directly benefited from being in that film project. They've given themselves over to something that they thought would kind of help things structurally, would help the world think and talk more humanely about drugs. And that is an act of giving that I can't necessarily say I myself have done.
But, and I, you know, that is something that you have to be so careful about. You know, even the simplest story that you are taking, again, it's somebody else's story, but you're configuring it, and it's absolutely true. You're the one who's going to, or you could fail with it too. That's even worse.
Mm-hmm.
You're exploiting somebody's story and you're not even doing a good job of it.
Right.
So that's even worse. Or, but anyway, so anyway, I think we have like a really great base ethically and all that. But these are the kind of things you're always got to be talking about in your team when you're planning, and a lot of this work happens like once you set up and you start. You could plan as much as you can, but then when you're in the place, the thing is happening, the cameras are rolling or whatever. It's kind of like a ship starts moving and you're just going.
Mm-hmm.
And but you always have the chance for carefully analyzing it and thinking about it in the editing room. And that's why the editing process takes so long, because you get that second chance. So when you're filming, you know, if really you're just gathering material, and you're going to have more success gathering material if you're well planned and organized, and also if you've, you know, built those relationships and are, you know, willing to listen to those people. But then when you get into the final finishing of the process, where you're like completely condensing time, you're completely manipulating everything, you're creating a fiction out of actuality, in the case of a documentary, then you have to be even more aware of how all of your biases and preconceptions and all that kind of stuff, you gotta work through it. Which is another reason why it is so fabulous that it's a collaborative process. It's really hard, you know, like I always joke, Ron and I, we've been making films together now for 20 years and we're still married. But that's what it is. And I've made films with lots of friends. I mean, they become friends and they're still friends, happily, you know, and the people that you realize that you don't have a equal mindset or whatever, you probably never work with them again. So
I think just generally, to wind this down and move on, but you know, it's about recognizing your own perceptual filters and the limitations that they bring to your view and comprehension and experience of the world. And like that is very true, I think, for filmmaking. That's one of the best things that we can do, is try to recognize those. So if we all went into the Safeway or whatever as an experiment and then came back to report on, in a documentary style, what we experienced, we would all have different accounts. Some of us would walk in and not have paid any attention to what's on the PA system, what music is playing. Others of us would have like listened to that and reported on that. And if we had, in that moment of documenting the ability, we would have recorded it somehow and like made that part of our representation of experience in line at the Safeway. Some of us would have noticed colors. Some of us would have noticed textures. Like there are all these different things. And I think it's just a really good technique as a filmmaker, as a media maker, to start to really cultivate a practice, a disciplined artistic practice, focused on recognizing what your filters are and then trying to accommodate those, go beyond those, beef them up, you know, make them a little, you know, better, or chip away at them, you know. And I think that's a really good thing to do as a media maker, because otherwise, you know, you don't really get to stretch yourself very much.
okay, so what about sound?
Sound.
Well, Dalibor had to leave, so he was here for sound.
Oh.
You'll have to give him a
That's okay.
private lesson.
Yeah.
Sound. Well, Kelly sort of summed it up earlier on. She said, you know, we've been talking about film for This is our third day. And she said, we'll have a brief abbreviated session on sound. That pretty well sums up the problem for the sound recordist, in that nobody cares about you. Everybody focuses on the picture, and nobody really gives you the time of day, but you've got a really important job. And one of the things that you have to appreciate is your element is as important, and in some cases or sometimes during the filmmaking process, more important than any other element, or can be. So you do have the power to stop the production. I mean, if you can't use something, if somebody's saying something and a plane flies by, or if you have a commercial radio on or something like that, where you know in the end you'll have to pay for the rights to a Rolling Stones song, which you'll never be able to afford, it ruins everything for you. So as a sound recordist, you have that obligation to the project, and also that power within your position to say, cut, we have to do something different. And it might be something like a refrigerator running in a kitchen, or just something. But the thing is, you have headphones on and you can hear everything, and the other people in the room can't hear lots of what you can hear. So the first thing to remember is that despite the way you're treated and ignored, you have a very important role, and don't let them rush you. You have to be ready, because the sound is important. And sound has, probably more than two elements. I'm thinking that there are two assorted elements within a film. First of all, there's the production sound, and then there's post-production. And you have to be conscious of the post-production. So in the editing room or in the sound edit, you can add birds, you can add all kinds of things. It's harder to subtract, maybe, but you can add all sorts of things to the sound, to the soundscape, and that's what makes a film breathe, and the addition of music or the addition of other sounds that you may or may not have recorded are really important. But that comes in the post-production phase, and you just have to be conscious of the fact that those elements can and will be added later on. So then your real first task is to sort of be prepared for whatever shoot it's going to be. And I've worked on lots of different films and in lots of different sort of situations. One that I remember that, the challenges that you face was we did a film about a man, and he wouldn't let me put a microphone on him. And there was just no other way to sort of deal with him other than to find a small stick and put the lavalier mic, they all have a little alligator clip on them, on the end of a stick, and use that as a sort of a mini boom pole, because, well, this was somebody that had been in prison for a long time. He would not let anyone sort of tie him, even if it was just a thin little wire. He had something about being attached to anything. He was a free man, and he was going to remain free and free of the microphone. And also he wasn't particularly he wasn't an eager subject. He was going along with everything, but he really didn't care about me or the film or what the results were. He was doing his own thing, which was speaking to audiences often. And so if you put the mic in one place, you could be guaranteed that he'd go someplace else, and you wouldn't have the sound for it, and you couldn't interrupt him. So, you have to sort of learn on the fly and be creative on the fly to deal with those kinds of different situations. The other thing, I suppose, about sound that is important is that you have to appreciate that there are all kinds of different devices that you can use to record sound. And all of them are good. All of them have their limitations. And I have a few of them here, and I'll just sort of look at some of them. But we talked earlier about making films on a phone, a smartphone. Well, smartphones have good microphones, and if they're in the right position, you can record your entire film on a smartphone, and that can be the way that you are obliged to work with someone. So anyhow, you have to realize that there are a variety of different methods of recording sound. I think the first time I worked on sound was with Kelly, and there was a recorder, and it weighed 25, 30 pounds. It was really, really heavy. It was massive, and we had to sort of haul it into the place. So there wasn't any running after anyone. You set up and you recorded with it. And now Greg has brought a very lightweight recorder that fits in a pocket. And this is where we've gone from, suitcase size to something very small, and everything in between. Now, you could spend a lot of time learning about each of these devices and how to enhance or adjust things in the field. You're not going to have time to do that in one day. You have to have a device and you have to play with it a little bit. But for the most part, they're ready to go. So all you really have to do is plug it in and press record, make sure you press record, and adjust your levels, and you're ready to start recording. And what you record on something like a Zoom, like this, which is an inexpensive recorder, is today as good as that giant unit or many of the other recorders we had in the past. Now, of course, the sound engineer at the end, won't like this, won't like that, but the good news is that they have lots of tools too to cut down on noise and do different things when they're doing the sound editing and engineering the sound for the film. So what I would just say as my opening remarks are that you have to remember that you have an important role. And a lot of people, a lot of films I've seen, especially sort of student films, because we have a college program here that produces many films in a year, but often sound is the thing that people forget about, and then they regret it, because when you get into the editing room, you can't recover it if you've lost it. And when you think about picture editing, if, for example, if somebody goes out of focus or if a light goes off, but they're still speaking, you can edit in some cover, B-roll, a photograph, some archival footage, something over that, and still, get through the scene that you were working on. You can do the same sort of thing with sound, but bad sound is harder to work with, I think, than bad photography. So it's just important to take your time, be comfortable with your equipment, and then figure out what is the best way of recording whatever it is that you're going to record. Tomorrow, you folks are going off to a gymnasium, and gymnasiums always have radios on or music on. You can't have that, so you have to ask somebody to turn it off. And if they don't turn it off, then for our purposes, you can do whatever you want, but you risk having the Rolling Stones or somebody come after you. And believe me, Warner and all those big corporations, they're on the lookout for this sort of thing. And
we had that happen, Ron. Like a week ago, there was some guys doing some wrestling in the background, and people just filming I was filming some lifts for a person, and got a violation notice
From YouTube.
Yeah.
They can pick out any song,
Oh, yeah.
one phrase of a song, and then they'll just cut you down. And Facebook is just the same. If you have anything that is copyright material, they
Well,
can.
now
Yeah,
Facebook
it's
automatically
just-
silences that portion of your video. They'll keep the video up, but it silences it. That segment is just
okay.
now just dead air.
so turn the radios off.
If you
Right?
can, yeah.
But that's the responsibility of the sound recorders, right? That you have to, everybody else should pay attention to these things and be aware of them, but that is really your responsibility, because in the end, the person they're going to yell at, in the editing room is going to be the person who recorded that sound and didn't notice something, right? So that's an example of the challenges you might have. The other thing is that you don't limit yourself to the sound that is sort of immediate to your project. In other words, you do need some ambient sound. We always record a few seconds of silence in the room just to get that ambient sound. So when it comes time to editing, and they want to cut something out, then they can make the room tone match the rest of the recording. But in addition to that, tomorrow your shoot will involve a lot of grunting and, I don't know, slapping on mats or whatever they do in a gym, and that's all good sound, right? The sound recordist should take some time and get some of that, because that can be used, and certainly even if it doesn't go into tomorrow's project, whatever you record visually or the audio will go into your bank, and then the next time that you need the sound of somebody's head cracking open or whatever it is that they do in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you'll be able to recover that. You won't have to go out and record it again. So, those are sort of preliminary suggestions on what to do. Another thing, and this relates to Greg's style, because I've seen quite a few of Greg's films, and with Greg, and I'm drawing a difference or distinction between the way I operate and the way Greg operates, maybe as directors, but also in recording sound. But the film we saw the other night, there's one place I remember where you ask somebody to explain something. So Greg is off camera, and you can hear the question, and he asks very few questions. It's happening, but he asked one question, and it's not distracting or anything like that. But his style is different from mine. In my style, I ask a lot of questions. I'm trained as a historian and I do use oral history techniques. So I can't get away from asking a lot of questions. But if you watch the films that I've made, you almost never see me, and you very, very rarely hear me in the films, because we just cut out the questions. So those are two different styles, and it depends what you're doing and what your style is. But because I'm asking a lot of questions, I have to also be conscious of the answers. So if I ask somebody, which we inevitably do, to tell us what their name is, so if I ask you to say, what is your name, immediately Dale is going to say Dale Carmichael, but that's not the answer I want. I need you to say, to repeat the question, my name is Dale Carmichael, right? So you, as the director, you should be watching that, but the sound person should also be listening for those kinds of things, because that's the kind of information that you may or may not need. It's much better to have too much information and cut out than to be lacking that information or be forced to think of creative ways of introducing someone. Because not every film wants to have titles on the individuals that speak, right? Sometimes you want somebody to do it. And you might ask the same question of a number of people. Nobody necessarily, well, you might want to have everybody hear the same question asked over and over again, but maybe you just need to ask it once in such a way that when subsequent subjects answer the same question, you already know what the question is. You're just getting the answer, and it's easy enough for you to work with that as a filmmaker. So the role of the sound recordist is to get good sound, but also to pay close attention to what's being said, and then you can always wait till the scene is over, till the director takes a break, and you can make suggestions. Sometimes you don't hear things as well as you'd like to have heard them, and maybe you want to do a bit of a retake. You can't yell cut all the time, every time you've got some little problem. But when there's a moment where you can breathe, you can ask if maybe they could answer that question once again, because a car drove by or something like that. We did some shooting, it was a drama, but out on Highway 61, and at one point we had people on the highway sort of looking down the highway and just judging whether or not we could get the 15 or 20 seconds, it wasn't a very long take, without a car or a truck or a motorcycle or something going by. And we just had to be creative. We needed that sound, or we didn't want to do it in the studio, and that was just one way of getting it. And after about 50 takes, we did maybe get it that time. But you have to.
No, and we didn't. We never did. We had
Okay.
to do voice over ADR, voice replacement,
Oh, God.
which is, does everyone, you know, it's whatever, automated dialogue replacement or whatever. And that is like, it's something you never want to do. Like, I mean, there's Hollywood movies that are nothing but that, but
Even when it's done well, you can notice.
yeah.
So anyhow, there we are. You don't want to use ADR, but I'm just
Yeah.
saying that the important thing is that you have to be conscious of all of that because you will get into trouble. And they, you know, might politely correct you or they might, you know, impolitely, you know, give you a rough time for recording that. Although I don't think I recorded that.
No,
No,
no, that was Danny.
yeah,
But
okay.
I have to
Good.
say that it's like all of these things are tricky. It's the whole kind of crew experience. So, for example, and it's true, sound people are always being stepped on, and people in the day when you have like this whole crew, you've got like 4 or 5 people working on the camera, the lighting, and you know, big. Usually, it's like 2 people maximum for the sound team, and so it's hard to be assertive, but and then sometimes you can't be too assertive because imagine a situation where you have actors and you know, you're making them do it over and over again because you know there's this car that kept coming by, and then after a certain point the actor just can't do it. So you know, those are all the difficulties. But I
Right.
have to just say that we just finished an experience, and I want to compliment our sound team, which was Skylar and Adrian.
And Dale,
And Dale. But it was like, one thing I have to say, like as a director, like, and I've worked with all kinds of different sound people besides Ron, and these guys were always paying attention and they were always ready. That was like that was the thing that was, I didn't have like even a momentary worry that you guys weren't getting it, right? So that's like critical, because in the old days when you were shooting film, like if you were a director, if you're shooting on 16 millimeter, which I did again, I was the cinematographer, Ron was the director, I have to have my eye to the eyepiece. Nobody sees what I'm seeing. You know, Ron could come and see it beforehand, but it's a matter of trust. It's the same thing for the sound people. We're not hearing, like Ron pointed out earlier, we're not hearing what they're hearing in the headset. And and I just wanted to say 2 of the most important pieces of equipment besides the actual recorder are the headset and the batteries.
Oh, yeah.
so, right,
As a sound recordist, you should have batteries just lined in your
I learned I
pockets.
could fit 30 in my pocket.
And know which ones are dead.
so,
Yeah.
so before we move on to, I want to show, you know, we'll talk a little bit about equipment. Greg, you've got sound experience. What's your worst and your best experience, I suppose?
I don't know that I have worst and best, but yeah, I don't think I can think of like worst and best. Yeah.
Well, this is the 12-step program. I'm Ron Harpel, and I have forgotten to press record, or I've had those issues, right?
Oh no, that's what you're talking about. Yeah, no,
Well-
yeah, I've forgotten to turn on the lavalier mics. Like,
Right.
just started in and like not even because I wasn't wearing headphones, so I didn't even hear it, and I wasn't looking at my signals, so I made all of those mistakes.
Right.
I
At
did
one
that
Well, you
time.
have to do them
just very
at least 3
recently.
times.
Yeah.
We did that.
I put in a new external
We didn't even
microphone.
get bad audio, we just got no audio.
Yeah.
It was plugged into the camera, feeding in
Uh-huh.
silence.
And then
I've done
I didn't put the headsets on because I was just there. And well, actually, it was Adrian and I went out, and I had got this new microphone for my XLR, which is really great, but it's got a little switch, if you don't, and it's battery operated. And Adrian he was recording everything. It was a concert through the mixer, but it was anyway. So afterwards, so
We got good sound, just
we got
impossible
really
to
good
sync,
sound,
that's
but it wasn't impossible to sync, but I had to sync it.
So batteries and
It's not
headsets
easy.
are important. And then there are good experiences where you're in the right place at the right time. And it's not just a question of catching the right sound. It is the right sound, but getting the right line when your subject delivers it, and everybody knows that's the line that's going to make the scene.
And the other one is to remember to clap. If you stopped it, remember to clap again.
Well, that's coming in a minute in terms of syncing things up. So, do you have anything else you'd like to add to sound?
What are you transitioning into now? I mean, I have some.
Well, I
just,
want to
like,
talk a little bit
tips.
about the equipment we have
Okay.
and the technique of.
Yeah, my list of tips, beginning with wear headphones, hit record, check your levels. Don't stay in the red, so make sure you're not peaking. If you're constantly peaking, you need to bring your input level down because it's going to be all distorted. I always get like a lot of room tone, like several minutes of it, because I just never know what's actually going on, especially if I'm doing the sound and running my own camera. So I would just say get more room tone or ambient or wild sound than you think you're going to need. I get a lot of characteristic sounds, so like floors creaking, traffic, cicadas, crickets. I'll just make a point of like going, because sometimes you hear those things that are in the background of a scene and they sound a little weird, even though it's like a cricket or a door, or like a door hinge creaking or a floor creaking. So I get better sound of that, and I might even layer that in so it's a more obvious sound if there's a lot of activity in the area.
I have a question. In your film that you showed us the other day, the fan.
Oh.
The fan a lot.
It was my nemesis.
Did you try to reduce the fan a lot in the mix? Or?
No, because it was like 35 Celsius.
Yeah.
And in the mix, yeah, I did a little bit, but I mean, there was only so much I could do because there were actually 2 fans going.
Making different sounds.
Making different sounds at different times, and the power was unstable. But yeah, so that leads to the next thing. I will often, and I appreciate when a sound person, if there's like a recurring sound, there's nothing we can do about it. I try to get a visual of it just in case I want to use that. And I was so glad I got just like a straight on shot of the fan, because it served as a nice transition point to the scene where they're experiencing it, and the sound cues you in, and then you see the fan, and then it's just all very quiet in the room, and it's like this warm feeling where everybody's just enjoying the effects of the opioid. So get visuals for some of the intrusive sounds, just in case the editor or the director wants to have that reference point so the viewer knows what they're hearing. Keep a log your audio as diligently as you log your video footage, and then ask the director about signaling. Do they want to say camera rolling, sound speed? How do they want you to know that you're recording? Those are my tips. That's all I got.
I was thinking of one other, because you were mentioning the fan, but Kelly made a film years ago, and the fridge was making noise, so they unplugged the fridge and forgot to plug it in. So the next day, they went back and had to replace everything in the fridge.
Oh, no.
So the trick is put your car keys in the freezer, and then you'll remember to turn the fridge back on. So those kinds of things, if you do shut something off and it's important, then figure out a way, like the car keys, which is a good way because you're not getting home and you will remember it, but some kind of reminder to do it. And these were poor people. They could not afford to lose everything in their fridge, right? So it's one of those things that you learn that goes on to the checklist.
And for like keeping track of your sound, like what are like the key things that you have to like know when you record sound, like to remember to write down or whatever, like what it is or what the sound is of, and
well, I keep very sparse notes because mostly I'm interviewing people, and mostly one of the things that we do is we almost always have a microphone on the camera that's operating. So that allows us, it makes it easier to sync things up afterwards. But then you have the record on with the image of the sound that's going on in the scene. And you don't have to mention that a dog, got in the way or you barked or something like that.
Well, I don't do too much, because I'm a post-production person, but we don't do too much writing, but I always check, like, especially if you're just filming for like 2 hours or whatever, like, just listen, just look back, look at your camera, your recorder, you can listen to it, make sure you got it, especially if it was like some amazing scene, and then you're gonna go. And then imagine if it was like, this is an event that it's never going to happen again, that moment's never going to happen again, and you didn't check it. And that happened to us a couple of times, and we were so lucky because it was a crummy sound. And so we actually had to go back and redo the entire interview a few months later. And it was way better than the first time. But anyway, I'm just saying that you very rarely you get a second chance. And then the same thing then, so I always, every single day when I'm shooting, I don't go to sleep. I transfer in my footage from my camera, and I transfer in the sound. And then I copy it onto a second hard drive. You just have to do that. Like, you can't, like, you don't feel like it. You've been shooting all day, you're tired. But it's like one of those things. It's like you quickly, something happened and you're so excited, you just started shooting. You didn't put the headphones on. And lots of times it's fine. The bad luck is not going to hit you. But that time where you just so regret that you didn't get that moment, because and also, again, that same thing is like, if the sound person didn't get it, they forgot to hit record or whatever, it's 100 times worse to let your ego not allow you to admit that you made a mistake, because we all make mistakes.
Can I just bring back on in terms of note taking, the easiest thing is say what you're recording. So
Yeah.
the beginning of almost every recording is creaking floorboard, creak floor, or room tone, or this is an interview, or if you have to like hit record and then like run away from the recorder and be like, this is going to be a lot of silence before it actually starts, so just skim through.
We used to do,
if you want to throw in little notes like that in your recording.
there was moments on the shoot where I had to work alone because he was acting in it, and moments where like I just couldn't have it like all the gear on me, so I'd have like a station, and then I'd say like, okay, this is a long take, and so I'd then run with the microphone over to where it was happening, and then we'd get, just so that or the person who's dealing with the sound afterwards knows that, okay, there might be some garbage at the beginning to just cut out, or just give them some sort of reference point for what they're dealing with here, right? Are they going to listen to 8 minutes of something that was accidentally left on, or are they going to listen to about a minute and a half of nothing usable, and then it starts, right?
This is, if I could jump in, one of my favorite sound recorders to work with is a guy in San Francisco, and I used to do like radio documentaries a lot for NPR, and they basically use the same report, and it's always super helpful. I don't know if you really need this level of detail in every production, but I always knew what the sample frequency was, and then like it's a boom or a lav, and like which channel, and like take one is Charles, takes basically 1 through 6, and then the next interview is Tanagra, and the next interview down is Eliza, and then he just sort of would make notes, like what's going on, or if there was a weird thing that happened, like some interruption in the sound. But and especially in cases where I would say that's going to be the take that we're going to use, he would just go ahead and notate, by the way, don't forget there's something in there that you're not going to like. So, I mean, I think it's good if there is a sound recordist to have a sound report like this, but if you're just a one-person show, maybe it's not possible.
I think that information at the top, sample frequency and bit rate, is more important than you'd think. It's embedded in the file most of the time when you're recording, but it is very useful to stay at the same sample frequency or bit rate, because if you go to a lower sample frequency or bit rate, that is what your film will have to be in.
Yeah.
So it'll lower
Oh,
the
goes the
quality.
lowest common
So
denominator?
You just, yeah, it goes to the, or else, because you have to compress everything down in the end, which, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and changing those midway through can really screw your audio. You can really like, you can stretch it, or it'll like stretch it, slow it down, pitch it, it does weird stuff to it. If you're changing in the middle of an edit.
So if you don't want to think about it, you've got probably settings saved automatically on your recorder. Just don't mess around with them, and then you'll be okay.
Tattoo the sample
Well, that-
on your arm.
And that's what I would say for what we're doing. Go with the factory settings. You know, you have to get used to the equipment before you can play with it and, you know, experiment with it. So the factory settings are fine for what we do. And maybe we should look at a bit of equipment so we can move on.
Let me make one confession though.
Yes.
'Cause the reason that you're seeing my friend Savannah with her painted nails holding the sound report is after the sound he gave them to me, I went out drinking and I left them in the bar where I met my friend Savannah. Like the entire stack of sound reports for an entire week. And she just happened to see them and was like, oh, these must be his. And then I had to have her send me pictures of them. So there's a confession.
Well,
Bad practice.
Kelly said we had to fire a camera operator. We went to India and a few other places, and we got there and we hired a local sound recordist. And the first day he showed up, he had a nice boom pole, he had all kinds of great equipment, but he borrowed it for one day. And we had to record with him for, 4 days or 5 days or whatever it was. And then he came with essentially a fishing rod, I don't know, like really, really rudimentary sorts of things. And then on the way back, the camera operator got really, really drunk on the flight, so drunk that they wouldn't let him get on the plane in Toronto to go to Winnipeg. And all of the footage for a month's worth of shooting, which he was responsible for, that he was supposed to back up, that he never backed up. All of that stuff was in his care. And then when he got home, his wife wasn't too happy with him. And so he was sort of in the doghouse for a while, and it was Christmas, and we couldn't find out if any of that material still existed.
No. The producer went over like that night but I didn't hear about it till after.
Right.
But anyway.
Anyhow, it was
So.
Backing things up, making sure that people you're working with are responsible.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
And
it's the whole thing is, okay, there's the shoot, there's the preparation, and as a director, I want to go and my whole focus is I want to be building that relationship. I don't want people to be waiting, getting worked up, and they know you've come there, you're gonna shoot, because it's not like you can often go and like just hang out for live with people for 18 months and then start shooting. You're gonna plan it. This is the day we're doing it, and the minute that you walk in the door, you don't want to wait for your sound person to then test out their equipment and put the batteries in and then find out they didn't have the batteries and all that kind of stuff. So, and it's the same thing for a camera person. Make sure your batteries are charged and everything is ready, and test out everything. Like, just have everything so that you walk in there, and because putting a microphone on, like Ron's experience, with this person who didn't want to be touched or be connected to anything, it is a very intimate thing, putting a lavalier on somebody. And if you're a man and you're putting it on a woman, and even if you're a woman and you're putting it on a man, it's a very kind of intimate thing. So you just want to make that as unobtrusive and then also with the reduction of the size of cameras to smaller and smaller. They used to be like massive, and you couldn't avoid that you're being filmed by a giant camera. But now this is the biggest thing, is the boom, and usually, I don't know where our furry went, but it's got like a big furry thing. It's like this big thing, and it's like right in people's faces sometimes, and that can be very, all of a sudden people are just like, they're not going to be relaxed and forget about you if you're going in with this big boom. But sometimes, like the boom, it's the most practical way of capturing the sound in a situation.
So let's get to that.
Okay.
So I pulled out a little bit of equipment here. So this is sort of our traveling kit. So it's a retractable boom pole. I think it goes out to 9 feet. And we have a shotgun microphone on the end. And basically, we've used this in a couple of ways. With some cameras, and I think that's one of them, it has XLR jacks, which are these big ones, and you could plug the microphone right into the camera. I don't think we really do it with this camera, but we have in the past used the microphone, and we didn't have a separate recorder. We just recorded right into the camera. Since we started using the Zooms, it's just easier, and since Kelly has new technology, it's just easier to detach ourselves from the camera. Excuse me. But, sorry. So sometimes we use the boom pole, and we have a long cable that connects the boom pole to a recording device, and the sound is separate from the picture. Other times, we have plugged the cable directly into the camera, but then that limits the amount of movement that's possible for the sound recorder. So it's, only in a certain kind of situation that you could do that. And more often than not, we will attach a radio mic. And there's one on this camera here. There's a receiver, and this is a radio mic, battery operated, with a small lavalier microphone that you attach to somebody's shirt or lapel. And this wireless system is what we use. Today it's going into the camera, but it also will go into any of the recording devices. So I have headphones, and you basically plug the headphones into the recording device, and then however the sound is getting into the recording device, it ends up being, in this case, in the palm of your hand. I have another Zoom, so this is a slightly larger one. It's a little more sophisticated in a few ways. But it's the same technology, and this one allows 4 microphones into it. This earlier version of the Zoom comes with a windsock, and these are the microphones on it. So in addition to being able to plug into the Zoom and record from a shotgun microphone or a wireless microphone, you can also hold the Zoom and record sound. They come with handles. There's one here. So you can attach a handle to it, and you're ready to record in certain situations where you're not going to be in front of the camera. This will work. But the problem with this is that you hear, and with all of these devices, you hear every snap of a cable on the pole, or every time your sweaty hand moves on the plastic. You hear all of that stuff. So we also, at other times, have just used little tripods and sometimes set up our microphones on a coffee table in front of someone. And that works as well, depending on the situation. So we have all kinds of different ways of recording sound. And this Zoom comes with a couple of different microphones. There's 2 different types of microphone that snap onto it, and there's a third, I think, that I can purchase for it. But the long and the short of it is that you have all of this equipment, and we don't have time to run through and teach you how to do it. But if you've ever used a tape recorder, an old-fashioned tape recorder, play, record, that's basically what these do. They rewind, they fast forward, they do all of that stuff. And it's really just a question of familiarizing yourself with the equipment before you do it. So don't show up on the day with the manual and try to learn how to do it. These days they're fairly cheap. I'm not really sure how much these are, but they might be $150 or something like that. And the quality is really good, and the other equipment might be a little more expensive. But we often travel to do our work. And as Greg was saying yesterday, he had a small camera and a backpack. He didn't have hardly a change of clothes that he could carry with him because he was walking 500 miles. Even if you're not walking 500 miles, it doesn't take long for all of this to add up. And first of all, it costs you more in your luggage, but it reduces the amount of things you can bring with you, because we travel with more than one camera. We travel with a tripod. We travel with all of this equipment. Those batteries that Skylar uses, 30 of them weigh 30 pounds. Like, they really, all of that adds up and does, limit your ability to, have all of the equipment on hand. So ideally, you want to have a small kit that you can attach to a camera or not. You want to be able to be independent and be able to record anything, and very quickly pull your recording device out and record things, or take more time and put headphones on and set up the microphones. We often use the radio mics, and the radio mics have advantages and disadvantages. The biggest disadvantage is that people wear a lot of polyester, and you often hear the scratching every time they move their arms. So there are ways that you can attach the mic so that it doesn't rub against anything. One of the things that I really hate is seeing the mic. I'd rather that people not know that people are being mic'd. And you soon forget about it. But, if somebody's got a white shirt on and you've got a lapel mic and it's on their shirt, when you're watching the film, to my mind, your eyes might be drawn to that and you're not paying attention to other things. So it can be distracting. These things come with little, they're called dead kitties, but a little furry thing that goes on it. But it makes a ball that's, the size of a golf ball or something like that in the end, when all you really want is just this little piece of metal. And ideally, if you can hide it somewhere, that works. So the way that you get around not having a lapel mic is by using a boom pole. And the boom pole, you have to, it's a directional microphone, so you have to come up over the person, or you might come under the person, but you have to get fairly close to the person who's speaking. And you have to hold the pole for as long as the interview goes. And it doesn't weigh very much, but believe me, after about 15 minutes and after 30 minutes, you have a hard time holding it up. And the tendency, of course, is for the mic to drop, and then the camera person gets mad at you because the mic is suddenly in the shot. So you put it up over your head and you stand there, and it takes a lot of exertion to be able to do it. But there are other things. I don't have one here, but we have a thing called a C-stand, but it has a special attachment that allows us to rest a boom pole in it, and then the sound recordist doesn't have to touch the boom pole. And we had a scene where we had two people sitting in a theater, and they were going to be sitting there, and that was the entire scene, was them talking. So we didn't want to have the lapel mics in the way. We want to have good sound. So we just perched the boom pole over them. And I guess I was doing sound. I was able to go off to the side and pay attention to the sound and not have to worry about holding a boom pole. There are a variety of ways of doing it. One of I told you about the first time I think I recorded sound that I remember, which was really heavy. Another thing that we did at one point was we traveled to Central America, and I didn't have a boom pole, right? I didn't have the money. We had camera, we had a microphone, but a boom pole was something that wasn't in my budget. So when I arrived there, I got a piece of bamboo, and I made a bamboom pole. I merely put an end on it that would hold a microphone, and that worked, right? It wasn't very long, but when we decided that we needed to boom people, that was just a cheap way of making having a boom pole handy and recording our sound. So that required a bit of innovation. a little bit of duct tape and a few things, and you can make it happen. I already mentioned the little stick that I had to use with this guy, and basically we were walking and talking, and he wouldn't wear the mic, so I had Kelly was filming as we were walking, and I had a little stick that I just sort of kept out of frame that got this little microphone as close as I could to him, so that we could record the sound for a particular scene. The other thing about the wireless mics is that they don't have to go on the person, so you can hide them. If somebody's at a podium, for example, or already speaking into a microphone, which is another problem, you can find a place on the podium or a place near them, and you can record wirelessly with these little lavalier and get good sound. I just mentioned one of the worst things for sound recordists, and that's public events where there's a speaker system, public address system. It's really hard to get good sound because you've got the person who's speaking, and you have these speakers that distort their voice, and it makes for a very difficult recording of that kind of event. We've also recorded music videos or performances, and they're a challenge. If you can't get into the mixing board, then these little recorders, surprisingly enough, are quite good. But you have to experiment with those kinds of things and meet each challenge with some sort of innovation and whatever's possible. But ultimately, it's not really that difficult to capture good sound. You don't have to spend very much on equipment. I would say that for maybe $500, you could have a really good microphone, a boom pole of some sort, and a Zoom or another recording device, and your sound would be adequate for almost anything you want to do. It's kind of like restaurants. Once you get up to $20 a plate for something, it doesn't matter how much more you pay. The food doesn't get any better at $40 or $50 or $80 for a steak or whatever it is. There's a certain breaking point with this equipment that you just have to get close to it, and your sound will be almost as good as the sound that people would pay an awful lot more for.
I think the most important thing is the person, the sound person. Like so many people, they cheap out on having a team. And, there's just so much obvious benefit to having, when you try to do everything yourself, and you just don't want to pay anybody, and sometimes it's just so worth it, because you're going to, you're getting people, maybe you don't have to pay your subject, but you're getting access that you've all invested in. It's just worth it. Like, make sure that you get somebody who's trained and practiced and is going to be there and help you, because it's just as important. So
So on
the
that
people,
note,
it's the people.
on that note, Kelly shot a film here in town and hired somebody with lots and lots of experience. And when it came to filming, he was off recording. He wasn't following around. He was listening to people. The idea was to get people together to talk to about things, but he should have been with the camera, but she had to go get him and say, I'm filming over here. This is the conversation to record. So this was somebody who was experienced, but wasn't paying attention to what was going on, and you can't have that. So this teamwork is really important. But you don't always have a team, right? You might be doing it on your own. And Kelly and I, fortunately, we work together, so we do always have a team ready to go. But you can make it happen even on your own. It's just that you have to appreciate that sound is important. And I should say as well that one of the things that you want to avoid is using camera sound whenever possible, because there is that distance between the camera and the subject, and you can hear it. So the reason we have all of this equipment is so that we can get up as close as possible to the subject and not hear that distance. But as I said earlier, we generally run the sound on the camera, and we do have a recording of it. So it serves as a bit of a backup because things could happen to your equipment and you can't catch it again. But also it helps in post-production because we have a guide track that tells us exactly where to cut in the sound that's recorded separately, so you don't have to have a clapperboard. And the clapperboard is used in dramas or in fiction films, not in documentary. You can use it in documentary, but people don't usually do it because it's disturbing to people when you want to talk to them about their dead mother, to have somebody come up in their face and snap a board or something like that. So you're much more subtle in documentary, and you don't use those things, and you don't need them for that. It's a bit different with film production because you have different takes and everything has to be recorded in sequence. And I think that's a brief introduction to sound.
I have a few like basic questions.
Yeah.
As for the Zoom, like you said that there was a couple different microphones that you could attach to it. You've got two there. How would you know, like, if you just, which one is good for which? Like, does it, like, when you buy them, does it say, like, this is good for room tone or something?
Yeah, they all have manuals. And, you know, I don't have the ear for it. I can't really tell the difference. I've tried them both and, you know, done some tests, and I don't really hear the difference. But then I'm not a sound engineer.
Okay.
Right?
Well,
So
maybe to the person that does know sound, why would you put like the fuzzy thing on it?
the fuzzy thing cuts the wind. So this is called a Zeppelin, and there's a foam. I left the foam on this microphone, but this is the microphone, and the foam cuts the wind. So you go out into a windy environment, it cuts the wind. But this thing, you slide it in here, and see it's hollow, so it slides in there, and then you have what they call a dead kitty. It's a furry thing that goes. You've seen them on TV, but it covers all of this, and that cuts the wind, the sound of the wind down as well. But wind is a terrible thing to have to work with, which maybe we could mention that. But if you are dealing with wind, it means you have to work with the camera person, because the camera person wants a perfect shot, but the perfect shot might not be good for sound. You maybe have to orient someone or find a place. You know, I can remember, you know, hiding behind buildings with people just to get the sound, you know, and we had to sort of maybe sacrifice the image just to be able to get good wind because, you know, we were in, you know, some situation.
So like the fuzzy thing on the Zoom, like the
It's
little
the same
hand one?
thing. It cuts.
So you'd only use that in like outside, and you wouldn't use it inside?
Well, it doesn't affect the sound, so if you leave it on, then you never lose it.
Okay.
And I use it inside or outside.
Okay.
It doesn't really matter, but it does cut down on the wind factor.
And that is another reason why you should always be monitoring the sound.
Mhm.
And just because you never know when there's, like, really, if we were, you know, we are recording this, but we wouldn't notice because we're so used to blocking out all kinds of annoying sounds and white noise and all that kind of stuff. We really don't notice it. But once you are trying to capture clean sound, because one of the things Ron said is you can always add stuff, but it's really hard to take things away. And then remember that when you're filming anything, you're never going to be like showing 30 minutes of a shot, or like it was very rare. That was the moment, that 9-minute shot that Greg got. But most times, even when it's like a interview situation, you are cutting out all the time. So if the background sound is changing every time you cut it, because you could cover over that cut, so you could take out a couple of sentences in between somebody's expressing an idea, and then you could, you know, put a shot of something else, so then it becomes invisible. But if you cut the sound and you know, like there was a truck going by and it didn't finish going by, and you cut it at that sentence, then when you cut to the next sentence, there's no truck. It didn't finish anyway, and so you notice, even if it's just very, very slight, it's totally disturbing. So and what you're doing is you're destroying the whole fiction of this highly constructed thing that you really don't want anyone to know is super highly constructed.
So a good example is Greg's film, because there was a fan running, but he said he shot it over 3 days.
Yeah.
So if one of those days wasn't very hot and the fans were off, and he was, compressing it, then he had to add a fan, just so you wouldn't notice that the fan isn't there, even though it's subtle, right? So that's done in post-production, but when you're recording the sound, you are aware of all of the sounds in a room or in an area.
I have one more silly question.
It's never silly.
Well, it could be.
For more of a basic thing, so if we're using a Zoom, is it like a SIM card or something that
Oh,
you
yeah.
plug into
Yeah.
your computer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
To like
Not a silly question.
Yeah, that is definitely not.
actually get the
So-
information.
Downloads.
So you'll remember, you will all,
Do not
maybe
call
not
me.
all of us,
Don't
remember tape recorders and cassettes, and that's gone by the wayside. So now it's a simple card, the same sort of card that you would use in a camera or anything else, and it records the sound. And so at the end of the day, we pull the card out of the Zoom, plug it into a computer and download it, and it's ready to go again.
Records the whole thing without the SIM.
How much does the battery last for that device?
Batteries last a long time
really
for sound recording equipment. You do need lots of them because this has 4 batteries. This has two or four.
Two.
Batteries. The other one has 4 batteries. And it doesn't pay to take chances. So when you start your recorder in the morning, if you see that you've only got 1/8 of the battery left, change the batteries, because you will never notice when it dies, and you will miss something, and then you'll realize that you've lost it. And so for the cost of batteries, for the cost to the planet, buy new batteries. Don't use rechargeable batteries.
But I don't know why these sound devices, unlike all our cameras and everything, have rechargeable batteries and like.
Ours is not to question why.
No, it is because it's a thing that we should be demanding. It's
Yeah.
absolutely stupid. Our phones are rechargeable batteries that last years, and we expect them to last forever, but they last at least a couple of years. On my camera, I have an extra, just 1 or 2 extra batteries. That's all you need. You just make sure that they're charged. This whole thing of, but actually,
But
no,
this is
there
what we
is
have to work with.
yeah, but there
here.
there are rechargeable batteries, and I did hear, but it's just that thing that you've got to.
My experience is that sound recorders claim to have rechargeable aspects, but don't.
Yeah.
Like the field mixer that we used on the film claimed to.
You can plug it into the
You
wall.
can just plug it into the
But it's
wall.
like your
but it
stereo.
claims, but it claims in the manual that it was a rechargeable function, but it didn't come with a rechargeable battery, or maybe it did at one point, but I don't know.
Yeah. Anyway, that's something to look forward to. If I was going to purchase my next sound equipment, if it came with rechargeable battery,
It's worth it.
Power,
Batteries are like
it would-
$50.
so be worth it.
So, and Greg has a very small recorder that he's used for lots of things over the years.
Yeah, it's a professional grade solid state recorder, 2-channel. It does not have XLR inputs. I have the bigger version of this, which is probably a little bit larger than that Zoom, probably twice as large as that Zoom, which does have the XLR inputs. And I have a big, like 4-channel field recorder, which I rarely use. Like if I hire a sound recordist and they for some reason don't have their own deck, they can use that one. It's a Roland Edirol. But this one's like my all-purpose go-to, just like when I'm traveling, light, very light, low-profile recorder.
What's that called?
It's a Marantz. You can just take a look at it. But I only buy it from the Oade brothers, and they're based in the U.S. and North Carolina because they get all the Marantz products and they immediately soup them up. So they put the signal booster, the noise reducer, and they beef up the preamp in it, and so then they send it to me. It's a little pricey. It's like $450 for that small unit, but
Worth it?
oh yeah, I mean, this has been a really good one, even for like the NPR documentary work. So the sound quality is pristine.
Can I add really quickly, you asked the purpose of the windscreen or whatever. It also has like a dual purpose of creating distance between you and the microphone. So just never have somebody talk like right into a microphone, because the way that the physics work is that at a close distance, small variation causes like a huge fluctuation in the level. So it's always nice, even when you have like a microphone on a person, if they like are looking down or looking up, it's a huge difference in the level and the tone of voice and things, which you can fix later on. But
And then
having a
someone
little
lisp and spit.
having a little distance is a good thing.
Well, there used to be, like, when people went to the smaller, let's say, you know, Handycam, that had all these automated features. They had automatic gain control, automatic zoom, automatic focus. And people were, you know, they just wanted to get their home movies. They just wanted to record, you know, their friend's dog. And all of those, whenever you get to something that's automatic, then there's going to be these, you know, a loss in quality. So automatic gain control with sound, sometimes the sound would go up and down, and it's just like the automatic focus. In the early cameras, you would always see it, the camera's like focusing, and if you move the camera, it's like, oh, now I gotta focus here, now, I mean, more and more of these cameras have automatic focus, follow focus, that are incredible. But in smaller consumer cameras, if you put it on automatic gain control for the sound,
Sounds like a nightmare.
it's a total nightmare, because the minute that my loud voice is no longer being heard, then all of a sudden it's like, oh,
Ducks out.
the levels are really, and so then it will bring up all the ambient
Yeah.
sound. And so then when you listen to it back, it's sort of like going like this, and you're wondering what the heck. So anyway, so those are, but the only way you can do it is by doing stuff and learning, and not getting too hepped up on you know, the few mistakes that you're going to make. So it's the same thing. Gather as much visual content as you can. Gather as much audio content as you can, and try to be creative. Just like when you're shooting, you know, don't always shoot from your eye level. Put it on the tripod. You know, shoot from down below. Shoot from above. And when you're gathering sound, you know, like, don't just go for what people are, the dialogue and what people are saying. Listen to the things that are happening in the room, those other things, because it's you being able to notice those interesting things that are, which will mean that you're going to capture that special moment. And then, of course, like, lots of us are going to be working on animation, so there's like half of an animation is sound.
And
Like,
creating sound.
creating it.
You know, we haven't talked about things like Foley, which is making sounds, you know, in a studio. But with animation, you can be as creative as you want. You don't have to have a horse. Record a horse galloping, you can figure out how to.
Isn't it something
Two
like
Make it-
coconuts.
before with the radio? Isn't it something like before, like with the radio, and they would have the
Yeah, that's
sound
Foley.
effects?
And, you know, there are people called Foley artists, and that's their job, is to replicate sounds. Now we have sound libraries, so there's thousands of sounds available. And people use those, but they don't always work. I know in films, what always drives me crazy is when they have the sound of a Harley Davidson on a little Suzuki 125. You know, but
Or
you know,
squealing tires on a
squealing
gravel road.
tires on a gravel road. That's the sound person not having lived or something. So,
I watched a whole movie last week where they were not in sync though, and it was like and then you'd hear the voice. The whole movie, I couldn't watch the movie. I had to like be doing something else so I could just hear it.
So are there questions? Yes, Sardine.
Just was Shirley making a comment. One thing I've noticed in watching, whether it's different documentaries or independent film channel or some movies, and it drives me nuts. It's where you're listening really hard because the sound is so crappy. You know, you can't, either the music is overpowering the narrative and you can't hear the people's voices over the background music, or like there's something with respect to the sound editing that somebody missed the boat. You know, and I think what we've seen in modern times too, right, is with commercials, that those sound levels, they've got them way up there, and there's then the big difference when you're transitioning from your television program or movie and going into the commercials. But the thing that I notice in films now is this difference in the sound, that there's definitely something going on with the sound editor, that they've missed it.
Well, we used to spend a lot of money. It's changed, but it was a big production. You had to find a sound studio where it would be, the sound edit would take place. And basically you can do everything on a laptop that used to require a building and a great deal of infrastructure.
Right?
So lots, maybe, I don't know which films you're watching, but often that's what it is. It's just not maybe people that don't have the experience doing it. Maybe they don't hear things the way you hear things. Everybody's hearing is different.
My hearing's not the best.
But in post-production, we always watch the films afterwards, and those are the things we want to bring some music down here, raise it there, pick up a sound, and the sound editors, sometimes they like birds, and you have to tell them we don't want birds or something like that. But you know, they have their little peculiarities. So that's part of the process, is trying to get it the way you want it, and then hoping that other people will hear it the way you do.
I find that it also depends on what the sound person has in mind for how they're mixing the sound. So for a lot of it, like some movies get played on TV, and for some reason they still have the sound mix that they would have for the movie theater, which is often far more dynamic. The louds are really loud, the quiets can be really quiet because of how big the speakers are, right?
Netflix does that for some reason.
Yeah.
There's cinematic mixes, and you'll watch a movie and it's whispering and then really loud.
Yeah, so they don't, and so sometimes these things don't get balanced out, or maybe they're not considering when they put them to TV that you might need a different mix because...
Also, some TVs
Yeah,
have
it is
those
very
little
different.
controls that you can go into and switch the way it's
Oh, yeah,
the
yeah.
sound.
Well, in fact,
hardly people-
when we used to have to pay, like, our first documentary, Banana Split, that we got actual money for, we did a sound mix, and it cost $8,000. And that was for a 1-hour documentary. It cost $8,000, and it took 4 days to do the sound mix and rent the studio and have the sound engineer and everything. And that was par for the course for all of any films that I did that went on TV. You did an actual literal mix in the studio, and it actually was really fun listening to, but you just inched along, you heard every little thing, and you would be in this studio with all speakers all around you, and it would just, you would pick up every little thing, and the editor had to work for months to make this thing, and then the mixer was making it all balanced. Then at the end, though, they would play it out through a little crappy TV speaker, because it sounded completely different. No one is going to be in a studio situation like that. So that was always the final test, was what it sounded like. And it's kind of the same thing too, is now we're all like editing on little screens, and you know, people are watching, you know, 50% of all video consumed is consumed on a cell phone. So you know, people are everywhere around the world, they're watching all the stuff on their small screen. And then, or if it's a bigger screen, it's going to be like a computer screen. So it's not very big. But then when you go and you put it on a big screen, like so what we do with our festival, it's a completely different experience. You know, things that when you're on a small screen, you need more close-ups, you need more quick pace. And when you're on a big screen or the Ultimate, which is like the IMAX or a 360, where you can look all around, everything you have to slow it all down. So that's the other thing, is that once the post-production process is also, it's important to test it out, have other people look at it, do it in different situations. Or if you know you're just going to go to YouTube, and most of the people watching it are going to watch it on their phone or watch it on a laptop, then make it so that it looks best and sounds best for that device that
Yeah,
they're going to be getting it.
Don't mix to surround sound and then put it on
Yeah.
YouTube.
Yeah.
So we should ask Sioux Lookout if they have any questions, and then maybe we could bring this to section to an end, unless there are more questions here. Hello, Sioux Lookout. Aha, got their attention.
Wave.
Do you have any questions?
Hello, Sioux Lookout.
No, there's a delay.
Hi.
Do you have any questions?
Oh, they're having popcorn, I think.
Okay, you have to put the sound back.
They are eating popcorn. Hi, Jack. No. Can't, you're muted.
Is the audio on there?
Oh, there we
you
are.
go. Yay.
So do you have questions about sound?
Do we have any questions on sound?
We have a lot of tech here, I think, through the multimedia library. I'm pretty good with a lot of the stuff you were talking about, so I'm sharing my experiences.
Okay.
You hear that?
Yeah, they did.
Yes.
So Nadine is admitting to forgetting to having pressed record in a crucial situation. That's what she's saying.
Did I say that? Sorry. Should I get closer?
Yeah.
No.
So what I was saying is that I have many, many audio experiences that I am sharing with the group, and there's a lot of tech here because of the multimedia facility that is here. So a lot of the mics that you're showing, they have here too as well. So we have a Zoom, we have some lapel, no lapel, we have a couple of shotguns. So yes, we're good. I'm sharing some horror stories.
Good, good.
Over popcorn, yes, over popcorn.
I have a small question,
Okay.
This is a new field for me. So I was wondering that when the sound is when you're catching a sound in an environment, every sound have a different frequency. So if you want to mute a sound, it says sound of fan in Greg's film, so you catch that particular sound and then mute that frequency. How do you delete a particular sound from a mixed environment?
You can't really delete things. You can adjust the sound to downplay certain things. But
Let
what you
Adrian-
capture
he-
is, and
he
Adrian
lives
spends a lot
this.
of time.
There's a program, you can delete any sound. Most things exist over a variety of frequencies. If something is just one frequency, like if you play like a signal generator that is playing 100 hertz, you could cut that out. So
everything has a unique frequency, like birds, their frequency.
but they have a variety.
It's actually,
variety.
it's actually a span of a bunch of frequencies. So some actually exist in some pockets, but then they have overtones and subtones that exist in all frequencies that create the timbre of that sound. So you can't really just find a bird chirping and cut it out, because that will also affect literally the sound of everything else in that recording as well.
Okay,
right?
so it is, so until the frequency is like straight and you can identify it is, if you cannot identify that if it's going up and down cyclic, then it's difficult because it's combined, so it's difficult to cut it out.
Yeah, if it's tone based.
If the sound is not, if the sound is not isolated, if the sound is isolated, then it's really easy to manipulate.
But
Like if it's just a recording of a voice or something like that.
yeah.
But like let's take the fan for an example. It's got like a variety of. It's got like kind of a low hum, and then it's got like maybe like a high sound from the wind.
Depending upon how how far is the speaker or how the wind.
Yeah, there's like so many different factors.
variables. Yeah.
But if you want to remove it, there are some tools in the editing suite that you could remove. You could clean if you spent enough time. You could clean it all out. There are highly advanced programs these days that cost $1,000 that will like allow you to go in and attach every sound and affect things. But it's very. It's not oftentimes it's not worth
Different.
the work, or
No, I understand.
you're going to be
It's
paying a
different
lot
from
to get rid
photoshopping.
of that noise.
Yeah.
Going in and taking one
It's like visuals.
pixel out of,
Yeah.
If you wanted to, you could by hand remove a person, and there's programs now that with AI and everything where it makes it a lot easier. And they have these little cheesy apps. You know, take out the background and we can put you wherever you want.
That's why I would say room tone is
Same.
very important.
Yeah.
Like that will change your life with editing.
so for example, and this one documentary we had to watch, I think it was like 14 episodes, and for a class in college, and it was Kenneth, I think it was Clark. Anyways, he was this, it was Western Civ, and every week we had to go and sit and listen to him for an hour. And the one thing that bothered me for the first 5 episodes, and then after that I kind of learned how to tune it out, was that
Yeah.
when he talked, and I'm like, why couldn't they just cut that out? It drove me nuts till probably about the 5th episode, and then somehow I got something that I just learned how to ignore it. And
At the same time, though, if his mouth was moving and you cut out that sound, his mouth would be moving without any sound happening, and then there'd be like a cognitive
and I guess they
dissonance
weren't,
there.
they couldn't tell him, please don't do that.
Yeah, some people just have their things. Right?
Well, he's an older person.
Everybody has their own voice.
Yeah,
So.
and there are people, I mean, most of my documentaries, I do spend a lot of time just when I'm cutting, and you know, I'm not the sound editor, but even just as the editor, I'll try to make sure that I cut out the ums, the ahs, the repetition, and so as clean as your base layer can be for an interview or somebody telling a story, then you can remove all those things.
Yeah,
But-
consider room tone your bottom layer in Photoshop.
Yeah.
It's like as nice as you can get. That is the closest to white or transparent that you can get.
And I guess they could have done it that way, that they didn't have him on the screen.
Yeah.
So because he always seemed to do it at the start of a sentence, so it was like all European architecture and everything. It would have been just to keep it on the thing and just cut that little part out.
That comes
and
down
then
to your
put his
subject.
voice.
If your subject's doing something annoying, you can ask them to stop it. But if you're doing an interview, like, it's their voice, it's their voice.
No, that he was like through the whole. 15
Well, one
episodes, 14
other very simple point is when you are interviewing and you're trying to get people to, and you're asking a lot of questions, you have to try to make your questions as succinct as possible, and also you have to make sure that you don't talk over them. So, you know, and then also when they're answering, you have to always be aware that you might want to join in the conversation, but you have to do your best to never talk over. And if you did talk over, then you might have to just ask them politely, could you say that, because I talked over you. And
Actually, you want to get very good at nodding and your sort of facial expressions, because you have to encourage them as though you're agreeing with them, right? And you can't laugh, because if they say something, even if it's funny, if you don't want, like, you know, you want the audience to laugh, you might not want your laugh in it. So you have to sort of control your sound as well as an interviewer and the people in the room.
And the other one was, this happened when I'm sure somebody was tapping their foot the whole time when I was interviewing one of the groups. And I could not, like, I could hear it, but I could not see who was doing it. and
Yeah,
short
that
of like
one you
going,
tell me
okay,
to knock
stop doing that to everybody, I had to just like hope it wasn't loud enough to really, but I
Yeah.
could hear it the whole time. It was tap, tap, tap,
But
tap,
that's
tap,
that,
tap.
and that's the thing. You can be like oftentimes you have to sort of lose a little bit of your inhibition. You've got to not worry too much sometimes about being rude and just saying, listen, but most people will appreciate it. They'll appreciate more because they want their story to be told. They want it to be usable. So most people would rather that you stop and say, listen,
Well,
you're
there was
doing
a
this.
natural break.
Stop
and I
chewing your
did
gum
stop,
and
I said, I hear this
yeah.
tapping noise, and nobody came out to admit it. The minute I started the recording again, it was there again, and it was like,
So
and I had moved the desks and tables so they weren't
Maybe
like
it
all
was
together,
you.
so it wasn't.
Yeah, maybe it was you.
But the other thing then is a microphone on a table. Because if you try to mic a table, people are knocking the table, and the microphone picks up everything that you don't hear unless you're listening to
The
it.
tapping could have been the cord hitting the boom microphone.
Oh,
Yeah,
definitely.
cords on a
It
boom
wasn't-
mic are really
yeah, it
terrible
wasn't-
that way too.
Or your grip. Or
Especially if you use the ones
Okay.
that plug in at one end and plug out the
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're gonna have like a let's just have like a 10-minute coffee break or whatever, and let's get into our teams and start planning our productions. And the mentors, we're gonna like kind of rove around and try to see if we can offer any advice if you need us, or feel free to ask us if you have an
What is
idea
the
and you want to
Wi-Fi?
pass it
Because
by.
it totally. it was
And then let's say at 9:30. At 9:30, we're going to we'll do the projection mapping session.
One or Trinity 3, one of those.
Okay.
I think Trinity 1.
three looks